So our next speaker is Revis Edmonds. He is the Federal Programs Historian for the Arkansas Historic Preservation Program. He's worked for the Arkansas Department of Parks, Heritage, and Tourism for the past 9 years. He holds a master's degree from the University of Central Arkansas, University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and Arkansas State University. He also earned his PhD in Heritage Studies from ASU. His research interests include Arkansas politics and its related culture, Arkansas's National Register commercial historic districts, and Arkansas's food culture. Dr. Edmonds is a former project historian to Governor Asa Hutchinson and authored the Governor's Cabinet Project, a study of Arkansas's executive branch. He's also a member of Phi Alpha Theta, the Arkansas Historical Association, Arkansas Museums Association, the Association of Critical Heritage Studies, and the 1909 Society of Arkansas State University. Please welcome Revis Edmonds.
It is not often that you get to share a facet of your state's history and relive a very fondly remembered piece of your childhood at the same time. And that's what I'm going to be doing today. And in the past, when I made this presentation, I would ask a question that 95% of the time the audience could not answer correctly, but yet now I'm in this audience, I already know that most of you can already answer it, so I won't ask. But we've gone through several generations where the common rule of thumb in Arkansas was that when you ask what was the state's first, what we would really consider a theme park, first answer come to mind was going to be Dogpatch. And the place where the first theme park actually took place is number one, probably about as far removed from Jasper, the Jasper area, as you can get. And at the same time, in probably the most unlikely place imaginable. And the man whose vision created this, you can say he could probably have had as many idiosyncrasies as Coin Harvey. But at the same time, financially, far, far, far more successful. So you could really say he could afford to lose some money in what really became an ego project. And this was Arkla Village. And the relationship, of course, to the title. Yes, for those of us who are dating ourselves, in fact, I'm spending my 65th birthday / Happy Medicare Day weekend reliving my childhood, talking about an irony, remembering one of the fondest memories of growing up in southwest Arkansas, and part of it even extended into my teenage years, even as I'll go forward. But Arkla Village, even though you wonder, why in the world was it put where it was put, was still the brainchild of one of Arkansas's earliest, what you would really call business visionaries. I think I've got this right. Yeah. First off, you wonder how it came to be in a place like Emmett. Now, I will ask a question that maybe some of you can't readily jump on. You know where Emmett is? Well, heck yeah, I know good and darn well you know. We're products of Little-
I know where that church is. I nominated it to the National Register.
Yes. We're both proud products of Hempstead County. But yet, Emmett, kind of there in the curve is your going east of Emmett towards Prescott, if you're familiar with Old Highway 67. And there in the curve before you get to what was the former Ephesus Primitive Baptist Church. But it was located along the railroad. And near the junction of 67 and 299, that's 299 south going towards Laneburg, Ralston, and that area. And Emmett's never been above 400 and something-ish. And like many communities in that part of the state, it was very dependent on the timber industry. And at one time, Emmett had several stores, had a couple of gas stations, had a cafe. Probably the longest lasting one was the old Hickey Brothers Texaco station and cafe, and it was a very popular place. And the Emmett Mercantile that was owned by the Snell family, later by the Duke family, and it would close in what came as a result of the closing of the Emmett Mercantile, and I think it's still there, is now called Congo Stove Works, I believe it was. It was one time Congo Mercantile out at Benton. But here's the real story. And where he really came with the idea of establishing the village, that's a little unclear to me, even though his public answer was always, I just wanted to see people happy. And that, of course, was Wilton Robert Stevens, better known as Mr. Witt. He was literally a business titan and pioneer. He first started making his fortune, or the basis for his fortune, selling belt buckles and other trinkets at civilian army training bases before World War II. And one of the sales he missed at that point in time, when payday came along, was a young recruit that came out of the hills of Madison County named Orville Faubus. And they never really dreamed that later that their paths would cross and cross so completely. But Witt Stevens would go from there, and he would practice a maxim that his father emphasized to him. He said, son, it is not a crime to be poor. It's a crime to stay poor. So, Stevens, during the depths of the Great Depression, when particularly local governments and school districts would pay their bills and pay their employees in what were called warrants, which were pretty much checks that were drawn on the school's own faith and credit, but not necessarily backed up by a bank account. And by 1933, the cost, these warrants had literally, the value of these had dropped down to nothing. The merchants who supplied schools and local governments, they couldn't get paid because the warrants were darn near worthless. So Mr. Witt gathered some backing from a friend of his father's and began buying up these warrants at 10 to 15 cents on the dollar. Then turned around and sold them at full value to what was then the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that had been established during the Hoover administration to provide credit for local governments, state governments, businesses, and so forth. So, Mr. Witt, you want to know how Stevens Incorporated began? That's how. Later, in the 40s, City Service Oil Company also had a natural gas subsidiary. And City Service, the natural gas subsidiary of City Service, which we now know as Citgo, was literally the running joke of the natural gas business in the United States. And it was just about in bankruptcy. With Stevens came, and also the antitrust laws required City Service to spin off its gas operations. Witt came before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and was required to put up earnest money to complete the purchase of this gas subsidiary. Well, the chair asked, did you bring your payment? He pulls in his pocket and pulls out a big wad of $100 bills. And his answer was, yeah, Judge, I brought it with me. And this is where Arkla Gas begins. And the development of Arkla is a story of its own, but it was literally the story of one of the greatest, not only business titans in Arkansas history, but also one of the greatest salesmen. Now, going to need all that salesmanship to sell the village, okay? So, why in the world did he put it in it? Good answer is he already owned the land. This was all near a natural gas pipeline and easement that Arkla had acquired when they acquired these holdings from City Service. So, near a compressor station. And so, you know how he got the land. What's his inspiration? He loved Westerns. He particularly liked Louis L'Amour Westerns. And then when you started having them on TV, it was said that Mr. Witt would never miss Dick Powell's Saying Gray Theater. So, but also, and let's just say this again, Mr. Witt never made a dime off the village. In fact, he lost money. That wasn't the purpose. There's always the other angle. So this would be an outlet for other products, but to bring your family there for other reasons. There's always the hook. So the original layout and the planning for this started in late 1957. Was going to be a general store, and the rule would always be nothing would be sold in that store that wasn't made in Arkansas. So you had horseshoe pitching cores. Now you think, why would anybody pay admission to go pitch horseshoes? Well, you have to remember that was Southwest Arkansas in the 1950s. You know, outside of going and taking a ride on the Reader, the old possum trot line, I'm just going to be honest, wasn't a whole lot to do in that part of the country. So you had the horse corral. I've ridden horses out of there. You had a show horse track and stadium right in the center. You can still even see outlines of that where all this equipment and stuff is now being stored out there. And then the Arkla Bell Steamboat, and that right, the Arkla Bell Steamboat was right about here, and it would just literally be right in the middle of the track, but when you could take a ride in the steamboat from one end to the other. Okay, for a kid like me, hey, It gets you away from home. But it also had an industrial center. Now, once again, I'm going to date myself and probably a few of you in here. You younger folks could not imagine being able to get all this just from the gas company. And today, you just hate paying your gas bill. But this is the profitable part of the village. First off, you had a saddle shop. It included a blacksmith and probably one of the best saddlery and tack men that Arkansas will ever produce. He was a Monticello native named Don Fuller. We knew him as Big Don. Don was probably 6'6", 6'7". I mean, he was a big man. And ran that part of the business for Whit Stevens until the village closed, and eventually began his own business along with a Western store in nearby Hope, and then was for over 30 years manager of what we now know as the Southwest District Fair and Rodeo. Manufacturing of buggies. Now, how in the heck do you make money off of manufacturing buggies? Well, Whit did. In fact, for many years, he and his successors had a contract with the state of Pennsylvania that would do these for special events, and even Amish communities would purchase these buggies. Furniture, the Arkla Village rocker. Now, you go today to Cracker Barrel and they have all the rockers and everything out front, and okay, they're fine. And here again, memory is what memory is. And you will hear today, there were few sounder built rockers than the Arkla Village rocker. And if somebody even was to have one today, I'd love to talk to them about it. Then the gas light. Those things were everywhere. I mean, just about everywhere you would have one in your front yard or your backyard. And they were selling those. You could, again, they were making those out of the village, and you could buy them through your Arkla gas sales office, where you could also buy gas appliances like washers and dryers and ranges and all that, and pay for it in time on your Arkla gas bill. And then, of course, the gas air conditioner known as the Cervelle. And the Cervelle made one particular salesman into another business giant, and eventually a political giant in Arkansas. And that would be the man who Whit would groom as his successor, Sheffield Nelson. Mac McClarty once said that Sheffield was the greatest air conditioning salesman that God ever created. But Don Fuller, man, Don, if you could call a leatherman an artist, that was Don. I said Monticello, I meant DeWitt. He did work as a sales rep for another saddlery company, and Whit came flashing the cash. Didn't take much to get him over to Emmett. But again, he, after the village closed, purchased a grocery store, a gas station, and built a Western wear store there next to it, and was best known. He was for 30 years the manager of the fair, and just died not long ago. Now, it's again, like I keep coming back to you, Whit didn't expect to make a dime off the park, and he didn't. But boy, he predated Sam Walton in the pure art of suggested impulse selling. I mean, think of it like this. How can you make an impulse buy out of a washer and dryer? Well, Whit did. They would actually sometimes have displays of the Cervell appliances even in the Arkansas Made General store there at the village, and would emphasize made in Arkansas in Fort Smith. But yet, Witt knew that you had to get the tourist in and feed them lunch, give them a sarsaparilla for the kids, let them ride the rides until you could get the other hook. And one of these was the Gaslight Bowl. Now, that was probably the most, what was the most enduring part of the village. It opened in 1960, 1 year after the village opened in 59. And it was probably one of the most popular bowling venues in that region. It was actually expanded twice, and it was popular among the locals and among the more regional semi-pro bowlers tours. And even in my day, I was a Hope High graduate of 1978. Even at that time, even though the village had been gone for probably 5-6 years, it was still one of our favorite Friday night hangouts. Yes, you could go get the girls at Arkla Village, where they came over from Hope, Prescott, or all points in between in Hempstead and Nevada County. Yes, I admit it. And I even established my speed record in my Ford Gran Torino between Emmett and Hope on the interstate, and Miss Duval Moore's speed trap. See, I'm telling about myself. I like when history is childhood. So they also opened a museum, and as a lot of museums are concerned, a lot of local citizens would supply artifacts. We'd hired a curator, and you also had Western themed drinks. Now, like I was telling Ray, and by the way, he has some photos from that. Y'all need to see them after it was all over with. I'm glad he brought those. But nothing like a cold sarsaparilla there in the saloon, even though to this day I still think it tasted like root beer. But at any rate, then in 1960, and it's one of the two buildings that are still remaining, right, in fact, it's right next to the Gaslight Bowl. It is called the Chuck Wagon Restaurant, and it became a very popular regional destination, and even several civic clubs started holding their meetings there during that time. Then the wagon business. Now, of course, events at the village also promoted the products that were made there. Again, that was and Peggy, I think you'll recognize the fellow there in the wagon. You remember Ray Turner?
Yes.
Now, you used to have the car dealer there, and then when he sold his dealership, he worked for McClarty for many years. But at any rate, he was doing, they did several trail rides, or what you could call trail rides, used the wagons and would do a special ride from Emmett all the way up to what we know now as Cherokee Village. Again, Witt was also helping finance John Cooper's development of Cherokee Village, so it was in his interest to promote both enterprises. These guys were smart. They were building capital and business acumen even before or during the time Winthrop Rockefeller got here. But eventually, the stops were there, and they eventually would go from Cherokee Village to Bella Vista and Bentonville. Then the roundup. I rode in a roundup one year. It was a lot of fun. Probably when I was about 7 or 8. But it was in June, probably in the hottest part of the summer, southwest Arkansas. Youth theme, there was an archery tournament that I couldn't even hit it hardly. I was the worst archer ever. Had a youth and adult bowling tournament, which was a lot of fun. Sharpshooting, now that was, they would literally give you something that was on the lines of a Colt 6-shooter and teach you how to shoot it. Of course, my dad had already taught me how to do those kind of things. We were right there. Horse show, had fast draw contest. Square dancing, stay away from that. And then the wagon procession, again, promoting the wagons, but go from Emmett to Washington, because also all this was envisioned as what we would call today a heritage tourism hub. And they envisioned that from Emmett to Washington, because Washington was being developed, wasn't that many years from becoming a state park. Then the Old Timers Day. And literally, folks, and you kind of try to wrap this in your head. Old Timers Day would attract 10 to 15,000 people to little old Emmett, because it was, for a lot of folks, it was reunions, people they hadn't seen all year. And of course, they got to meet the politicians, and they got to meet Mr. Witt. And the big draw for many years was Orville Thomas. So, and several of you asking, particularly Peggy, you know, what happened to the village? Well, the interstate's what happened, among other things. The Emmett exit, I believe it's exit 36, Highway 299, it opened in 1969. And at that point, the only part of the interstate that was still unfinished was from the Emmett exit to Fulton. If you're familiar, Fulton, just this side of the Red River. And the rest would open in 1972. That one of my dad's businesses would be right off of the 31 exit in Hope. So all this is just going to transform the area. Travel patterns were changing, and even recreation preferences were changing. And this is kind of along the twilight of Whit Stevens' tenure at Arkla Gas. He's already planning to retire from the company, but still keep running Stevens Inc. by 73. And he is grooming his successor, which would be Sheffield Nelson. For many years, Sheffield had argued for selling off what were obviously unprofitable parts of Arkla. One of them was the village. The other was Foreman Cement down in Foreman in Little River County. That was the business being run by his old friend and ally, one-time Speaker of the House, Marion Crank. If you've ever seen the Rockefeller publication, Cranking Up the Old Machine, well, that was a reaction to Crank's gubernatorial candidacy in 1968, which was almost a totally owned subsidiary of Whit Stevens. So, but Nelson was not so much into that. And of course, he wanted to build his own base at Arkla, but the village was losing money. Foreman Cement was losing money, and Arkla even had a petroleum products and lubricants division. They had gasoline stations, sold bulk lubricants. Back in the day, Arkla, in a lot of places, Conway used to have one, and there was one down here next to where the post office is, off of 6th and I-30, near where the Coachman's Inn. That was another Stevens enterprise. Witt kept that one until they tore it down. But they would build these combination of an Arkla sales office and an Arkla service station with a canopy over the pump islands, and the post in the middle was shaped like a blue gas flame. And eventually there were some local wholesale distributors. One was from my family knew. His name was Norman Moore from Hope, when needed a place to go when city service pulled out of the state. So all of these were going to be spun off, many of them even before Sheffield became CEO. So the village would close in '71, and then some of the other enterprises would still operate at the village, and they would be sold off piecemeal. And they were pretty much all gone by '75. The Chuck Wagon restaurant closed in '73. And the Gaslight Bowl was the most long-lasting, but all it was the new operator was leasing the building and he owned all the contents. It was just money for Arkla. And eventually, when a new bowling lanes opened in Hope, the Gaslight Bowl finally closed in '82, but it was fun while it lasted. What remains of the village, I mean, other than those two buildings, there's no evidence that the village was ever even there. It is now a maintenance facility and regional operations center. It started that way with Arkla. They at first used the village buildings as offices and shops and all that kind of stuff. Eventually they replaced them, and now it looks pretty much like a big open equipment yard. So what became of its businesses? Again, much of it was spun off, particularly the Buggy Works, sold to a man out of Jonesboro who still kept the contract with the state of Pennsylvania, making Conestoga wagons. And then Don Fuller moved the tack business to Hope. The rest of the artifacts out of the museum, as I kind of explained earlier, was donated to the Old Washington Pioneer Restoration, which is still in the collection of Washington Historic State Park. And that's another kind of wallet, photo of a wallet that was made in the leather shop there that was sold in the village store. But again, it was one of those little anomalies. It only lasted for 14 years. But at the same time, it gave a little bit of business and activity prominence to that part of southwest Arkansas that for many years has literally survived off the timber and poultry industries, and still does. Thank you.